Thanks very much. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's very exciting Free Library of Philadelphia Foundation author event. It is wonderful to see you all here. Tonight marks just the third installment of our spring season. We have about 35 author events planned over the next 5 months. We'll welcome to this stage scientists, historians, novelists, travel writers, poets, and so many more. There is quite literally something for everyone, and I hope you will join us. Tickets are selling fast, so please do register soon. And you can sign up for our mailing list by visiting our webpage at freelibraryfoundation.org. I also want to say just a few words about our organization in general. The foundation works together with the Free Library to support programming and advance its mission of promoting literacy throughout the Philadelphia region. But as a nonprofit, we are reliant upon your support to achieve these goals, so please do consider donating. You can use either the QR code on those handy bookmarks that I hope you were handed on the way in, or you can donate through our website, again, freelibraryfoundation.org. Before we get to tonight's program, there are a few people and organizations I'd like to thank. We're grateful first and foremost to this season's sponsor, Comcast, whose support allows us to keep these events as accessible and as affordable as possible. I'd also like to thank Uncle Bobby's, our partner bookseller, and the Philadelphia Citizen, our new media partner. And finally, I'd like to thank the volunteers, a dedicated group of library patrons whose loyalty to this program is unmatched. This evening, we have with us Charlie, Mimi, and Paula. You probably encountered some of them on your way into the auditorium this evening, and we are just so grateful for their support. Tonight, we welcome the prize-winning journalist and historian, Juan Williams. He is the author of the best-selling civil rights history, Eyes on the Prize, America's Civil Rights Years, 1954 to 1965, which accompanied the PBS series of the same name. He also wrote the landmark biography of the first African-American on the Supreme Court, entitled Thurgood Marshall, American Revolutionary, as well as the New York Times bestsellers Enough and Muzzled, The Assault on Honest Debate. Williams worked for the Washington Post as a celebrated national political correspondent, as a White House correspondent, and editorial writer. He is currently senior political analyst for Fox News Channel and a columnist for The Hill. He'll be speaking with us tonight about the long-awaited follow-up to Eyes on the Prize, entitled New Prize for These Eyes, The Rise of America's Second Civil Rights Movement. He will be joined in conversation by Marsha Levick, who is the co-founder and chief legal officer of Juvenile Law Center, America's first public interest law firm for children. Throughout her career, Marsha has advocated for youth involved in the justice and child welfare systems, and she currently manages Juvenile Law Center's national litigation docket. Marsha has received numerous awards for her work, including the Philadelphia Award, the Arlen Specter Award, and the 2009 Philadelphia Inquirer Citizen of the Year Award. Most recently, Marsha has been named the 2025 recipient of the Philadelphia Citizens Social Justice Champion of the Year Award. Marsha is also an adjunct professor at Columbia Law School, Temple University Beasley School of Law, and the University of Pennsylvania Law School. This is clearly going to be a really interesting conversation. Please join me in welcoming Juan Williams and Marsha Levick.
Thank you, Dan. Hi.
Good evening, Juan.
Marsha, it's you again.
It's me again. Juan and I have known each other for a long time. Good evening to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. So we're going to get right to it. 40 years ago, you wrote Eyes on the Prize. Why did you write this book now?
So you right away, you start out by revealing my age.
We are of a certain age.
I am 70 years old, and can you imagine, 40 years ago, I wrote Eyes on the Prize, a companion volume to the very successful PBS series. And it told the story of America's first civil rights movement. I say first because it's mid-20th century, and it's clearly intended to gain passage of the Civil Rights Act, 1964, and the Voting Rights Act, 1965. And you have the Great March on Washington, 1963, 250,000 people led by Dr. King. And to my mind, for this 70-year-old, that's the first civil rights movement, the civil rights movement that I grew up with, an incredible story, so rich, and I wanted to tell that story. Wonderful opportunity. Now, at this age, 70, I see a second civil rights movement taking place, and it is so different than the first that people sometimes say to me, I don't see it. Maybe you're saying the first civil rights movement continues or it has evolved. And I say, no, I see a second movement. And in fact, the second movement that I see is bigger than the first movement and has more impact on us as Americans than the first movement. Why do I say that? Well, think about that example I gave of the Great March on Washington, 250,000 people one day in Washington, D.C. After George Floyd was killed, there were thousands of marches all over the United States. More than 26 million people took to the streets. And it wasn't just in the United States. You could have been in Paris, you could have been in London, you could have been in Buenos Aires, and they were marching under the banner, Black Lives Matter. And when I talk about impact, again, the agenda for the first movement was clearly legislative, getting Congress to act. Here's a movement now, the second movement, in which the agenda is more diffuse because the ways of communication have shifted so amazingly. Now it's like 24/7. 24/7, people are online, they've got memes, they've got images, they've got messages, they've got tweets. Everything is going viral, and it's a constant conversation. And it's a constant conversation about issues ranging from mass incarceration to police brutality to income inequality to poor schools. And of course, as you are all here tonight, you know what's going on in terms of the Trump administration agenda, which I think is forcing this second civil rights movement into everyone's space and helping them understand that when Trump goes after diversity, equity, inclusion, he is taking on what he sees as a second civil rights movement that's impacting, already having impacted, the American people at a moment of tremendous demographic change in our society. So to me, there's something going on, and I just want us to be alert to it.
Do you think, in listening to your answer, I was sort of ticking off in my head, it's larger, it's done through social media. Do you feel that there's a very pronounced difference as well in terms of the goals and the objectives of the second civil rights movement? You talk a lot in your book about the first civil rights movement really being focused on de jure segregation, really challenging the laws that allowed segregation to take place, that allowed black people to literally be treated as second-class citizens. What is this second civil rights movement focused on?
Well, you're exactly right, and Marsha, unlike many people who interview me, you read the book, so thank you. I can't, thank
that was
you,
my
Marsha.
job.
Right, thank you, Marsha. A lot of people think they're slick. So I would say, as you said, the first civil rights movement, I think, is best encapsulated for a conversation like this in thinking about Rosa Parks, right? No, getting out of the back of the bus and having the government, in terms of the civil rights laws, say, we will enforce your right as a citizen, regardless of race, to be protected in terms of your constitutional rights. And that's what the first civil rights movement was about. Fast forward, second civil rights movement, and I think we're now in an era in which we are talking about the lived experience of being a minority in America. And it's a very different kind of agenda, and it's more diffuse because I think, one, there is no Dr. King figure today leading the second movement. That's another clear distinction, first to second. the people who created Black Lives Matter were 3 women. They did it online, and they were pretty disdainful of the idea of having a leadership hierarchy, certainly not a patriarchy, and they wanted people to have control of the agenda in their locality. So if you're in Philadelphia, you may have a different agenda than if you're in Miami, St. Louis, LA, that you know your issues. And so that's the way what they felt, and so they gave people chapters with the Black Lives Matter title, and it had some good results and some bad results in terms of lack of transparency, lack of accountability, lack of centralized leadership. But when you ask about the agenda, I think it's very easy to understand that the conception begins with Trayvon Martin's death when he's killed by a volunteer security guard in Florida. By the way, the women who respond after that security guard is acquitted are in California. So again, just keep in mind this tremendous difference in the way the communication is taking place, the platform for this second movement. But in terms of the agenda that you asked about, Marsha, I would say that it's pretty clear then. It starts with not only Trayvon, but goes on to so many cases of people, Eric Garner in New York who died when he was choked, you think about Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and then you go on. I mean, there are others in between, believe me, but you go on, and of course, the big one would be George Floyd in Minneapolis. And clearly, police brutality, especially against low-income Black men, is a point of focus here. But it's not the only one. You stop and think about some of these larger issues, and you can see that right away, Black Lives Matter introduces conversations about diversity in an America that is so unlike any America that's ever existed. Why do I say that? Because just thinking back to 1960, to the first movement, and using that to kind of frame our discussion and our thinking, courtesy of Marsha. In 1960, close to 90% of the American population was white. About 10% actually was Black. There are almost no Latinos. Today, the largest minority in America is Latino. Blacks are about 13% of the population, somewhat larger, but in terms of the overall picture, the big difference is that whites have gone from about 90% of the population down to about 60% of the population. And then, keep in mind, the fastest growing minority is Asians. Wow. So what was previously a conversation between Blacks and whites is now a conversation among people coming from lots of different angles and experiences, and it's global. Immigration is very much central to this, and you can see that in the difficulty it presents in terms of our political lives. But that then leads you into conversations about mass incarceration in addition to the police brutality. It leads you into conversations about should we have race as a consideration in terms of public policy in America in this so radically diverse society? Is it right to have consideration for race if you're thinking about college admission? What about hiring? Is it right to have race as a consideration when you're thinking about income and the inequality that exists in terms of income structure by race in American society? What about bad schools? What happens when you say, oh my gosh, here we are early in the 21st century, and if you look at schools in minority neighborhoods, not only do they have lower levels of academic achievement, but often hyper-segregated in terms of Blacks, Latinos, you'd say, my gosh, it seems like we're going backwards. So I think, in answer to your question, it's almost as if, yes, the first movement said the government is committed to protecting your constitutional rights as citizens, regardless of race. And now in the second movement, people are saying, well, the lived experience is a little different. I still see bad schools in my neighborhood. I still feel like the cops view me as a suspect, not a citizen. I still don't see that things have changed for me in terms of the quality of the schools available to my children. I could go on, but that is the broader agenda that's impacting us as the American people in this second movement.
So one of the things, again, proving that I read your book, that surprised me about your book is that you say very specifically, and then go on at length to speak about it, and I'm going to ask you to talk about it, that you believe that you can't really understand the second civil rights movement, where it came from, how it's developed, what its impact was, without understanding the Obama presidency. Talk about that.
Wow, exactly right. Thank you, Marsha. Because the thing about this is Barack Obama is a politician. He's not a civil rights activist. So here I am talking to you this evening, talking to Marsha about a second civil rights movement. But you're exactly right. Barack Obama comes on the scene, so 2004, in terms of the national scene, as a little-known Illinois state legislator, but he is running for the U.S. Senate, and John Kerry makes the decision to have him, give him a primetime speaking slot at the national convention, outreach to the black voters that Kerry is worried that he is not winning. And Obama gives a speech, and I bet Marsha could recite the anthem of that speech. We are not a black America.
Yes.
We are not a white America. We're not an Asian America, Latino America. We're the United States of America. It was an uplifting, optimistic. I was in the room in Boston, and when he came on stage, Marsha, people were like, who is this guy? And people are talking and carrying on. It's a convention. About halfway through, the place is quiet. People are standing and applauding. It's like people have seen a new dawn in terms of race relations in America. Who has seen a major black political figure or civil rights leader not speak in terms of grievance and anger and upset over what has happened in the slavery, the discrimination, the Jim Crow, the lynching? Here he is saying, my story could not have happened in any other country but the United States of America. It was a love song to America coming from a black man. So this wasn't your angry, alienated black man. This was like a black man saying, we're into a new era, and soon it was called post-racial, that we're entering into a post-racial America. And Obama goes on to then win the presidency of the United States, first black president, stunning people. I remember Ebony magazine had on the cover, "In Our Lifetime." It's that unbelievable. And I remember the poster. The poster for his campaign had him in sort of beatific perspective.
Multiple halos around it.
Halos, exactly.
Yes.
And underneath it said, hope. What a positive message. Hope. Again, so he wins, and it's like almost like a rock star, because he's like a prophet delivered among us to talk about race in different terms. And there's all this hope attached to him. Well, pretty soon, there's also criticism, and pretty soon there's something of a backlash, especially when he bails out the banks and not Main Street as a result of the financial crisis that faced him when he first entered office. And then, when his key legislative item was Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, you saw especially working class whites say, hey, you're taking apart my health insurance policies and you're going to give my tax dollars to those people? You're really looking out for the blacks, the Latinos. You're a black president. And Obama's like, no, I'm not the black president. I'm the president. And I'm the president of all the people. And he's making the argument that his policies are good policies, but this backlash under the Tea Party label at that time is taking hold. And of course, just for the shorthand, you know that Donald Trump comes along with the birther movement and says this guy shouldn't even be president. He isn't qualified to be president. The first black president he says isn't even an American. And it acts to undermine Obama so much so he has to produce his birth certificate. It sounds ridiculous. Why would the president do that? But he has to. And then what you see is a lot of anger. Anger takes root in the country. You know, when we have incidents like Trayvon Martin that I've touched on, and Obama says, if I had a son, he would have looked like Trayvon. There are people who say, my God, why are you making this so racial? You know, you're the president. I thought you were the president of everyone, but you're now taking the side of this black kid over the security guard, and you don't know anything about it. So all of a sudden, his numbers, his approval rating in white America starts to go down. When Henry Louis Gates, the Harvard professor, is arrested, he'd come home from a trip, he didn't have his keys, trying to get into his house. The neighbors say something suspicious is going on over there, call the police come. Gates identifies himself, says this is his house, but he and the cop get into arguments, and the police arrest him. And Obama's comment is, the police behave stupidly. Why are you going to arrest somebody who's trying to get into their own home? Well, then people said, again, you're taking the side of the police, the side of the black man over the police. And in this case, Obama's approval rating among whites goes from well over 50 to never again seeing the 50% mark. That was it. So what you see is the racial overlay to Obama that initially boosts him, then twists and turns and becomes something different. And I think that in the midst of this, we're going through those cases, you know, so many of them that test a real issue for black America, which is if you have the kind of fruit of the first movement come to reality, which is black political power, a black man in the highest office in the land, is he going to do something different for black people in this country? Is there going to be justice delivered in a way that's never been delivered before? And there was a lot of discontent, a sense that he was staying away from racial issues, that he wasn't reading the room in terms of black political support as the base of his political support. So on all sides, there is this racial political lens that I think is so central if you really want to understand the Obama presidency.
So, I mean, I thought that was fascinating and appreciating. He wanted to be a president who happened to be black. He didn't want to be a black president.
Right.
But in centering the second civil rights movement really squarely with Black Lives Matter, you also have a lot of criticism of Black Lives Matter in your book. So talk about that.
Well, I don't, you know, obviously the financial
Maybe we'll call
stuff.
it a critique, not so much a criticism, but
No, I think it's fair. You know, the thing about doing history is it's a real privilege to be the writer because you get to learn. And sometimes you learn things that you don't want to see. But in telling the story, I think it's compulsory that you tell the story with energy and purpose and direction for the reader, if the book is going to have historical value. And, you know, the first Eyes on the Prize, I can't tell you, people all the time tell me they still read it, still use it as a reference point. So that's important to me. And when it comes to Black Lives Matter, it's kind of this miracle birth, as I said, over the internet after the Trayvon Martin case. But what you see is this diffuse leadership, and then you see incidents of lack of accountability with regard to finances, maybe most clearly after George Floyd. More than $90 million flow into the Black Lives Matter coffers after George Floyd. America reacted, and this is a very important point, Americans, black, white, Latino, Asian, all reacted like, you know what, we support Black Lives Matter. More than 2/3 of white Americans supported Black Lives Matter in the aftermath of George Floyd. And the numbers among Latinos and Asians and blacks was like almost 90%. So you can see this was a moment of racial consensus in the American mind, and the money flowed in tremendously. Real questions about where that money went, about people lining their own pockets or the pockets of relatives or friends, and a lack of taking it seriously that you have an opportunity here to build something with lasting value in terms of creating social change, especially racial change in America. One of the points of critique that emerges in my mind as I'm writing and learning this story of Black Lives Matter is that there is this disdain for politics. It's almost like, hey, politicians suck. Politics, that's for old people, or politics is all about compromise, and I want immediate change. I'm here to demand justice and racial equality, and these people are talking about passing some piece of legislation and might eventually do something. I want change now. And so you see that there are opportunities, and this really strikes me because I've been a White House correspondent, is that people, even with Obama, the first black president, are refusing meetings at the White House. You're thinking, wait, you don't want to talk to the president? No, they don't want to talk to the president. They think they have all these criticisms of the president, totally legitimate to be critical of the president, but the question is, are you willing to work with the first black president as a civil rights activist? And many of these younger people are saying, no, they have such disdain for politics and politicians. And I think this was a lost opportunity. And I think this extends, if you think of it in local terms, to mayors, to city council, to a lack of conviction that you need political power if you are to achieve real change in American society. And that kind of leads me then to thinking about where we might go next. But to me, that's the strong critique of Black Lives Matter in the book.
So, but I also get the sense from your book that you still see certainly the banner, the slogan, Black Lives Matter, is what is driving the second civil rights movement, which we're in. So how do you see, today, tomorrow, next week, how do you see the second civil rights movement playing itself out where it lacks leadership in the way that the first civil rights movement did? Right. It is incredibly dispersed and diffused. What do you see for their work in this moment?
So I think, Marsha, obviously, it's one thing to write the book. I mean, what you're asking is what's to come, and I haven't
written that book yet.
But
if you were to write it.
But what I perceive is that people will have to start forming coalitions. One of the things that Black Lives Matter didn't do, I think, effectively, was reach across lines. For example, abortion rights is a major issue in American society, and it's a major issue for a key voting bloc, American women of all colors. And yet you didn't see this form as a coalition, that Black Lives Matter somehow didn't put their stamp, their hands in there and say, we're joining hands in support of this movement. Or you stop and think about something like the tremendous amount of immigration going on in the society. I'm not just talking about illegal immigration, I'm talking about legal immigration to America, and the growth in groups of people of color. And here I'm thinking not just about Africans and Caribbeans and Latins. And again, was there an effort by the Black Lives Matter banner to say, we are understanding and embrace the immigrant experience in America, and we ask you to join in with us, to join arms with us? Again, I don't think so. I think this is the forefront, this is the frontier of opportunity that still exists for Black Lives Matter. The thing about it is, when I say Black Lives Matter, I say Black Lives Matter because I think it is the easiest handled, and it was the point of birth in so many ways for this second movement, apart from Obama the politician. But to me, Black Lives Matter is also the point of opposition for Make America Great Again. So you think of these two powerful movements at play in American society, one that stands for the DEI material that is so pertinent at the moment in the first weeks of the second Trump term, and one that stands clearly in opposition. We have a president who was endorsed by the KKK, a president who is allied with Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, and people who marched through the Capitol with a Confederate flag. And to me, to not understand the political dynamic that has lifted up the white supremacist movement in this country, the people marching through Charlottesville with a tiki torch, the people saying Jews will not replace us, the people who believe somehow that whites suffer more discrimination than people of color in the United States. I mean, unbelievable, but that's what they tell pollsters they believe. You got to understand these are as two powers of conflict, and Black Lives Matter has to counter the political basis that is now lifting up the Make America Great movement.
So I'm resisting the desire to have an entire conversation about what happened today and yesterday and will happen tomorrow. But I want to ask you, in thinking about, in a way, the failure to form those kinds of alliances, one of the other observations that you made in the book about the first civil rights movement was how that movement of the 1960s, which really was focused literally on law reform, really gave birth to a whole slew of other movements, the women's rights movement, organizations around disability rights, the Latinx movement, LGBTQ. I want to say Juvenile Law Center was founded
I was going to interrupt.
on the heels of the 1960 civil rights movement. That's a really powerful legacy for that first civil rights movement. Will there be a similar legacy for the second civil rights movement? Or is it what you said, where they just haven't made those connections?
Well, some of the connections are just on us already. I mean, clearly, because we're so much more of a diverse society than we were in the first movement, you have people who are raising these issues on their own. And so, things like, one of the things that the founders, the three women who founded Black Lives Matter, insisted on, was saying that gay people and transgender people are part of their movement. But they never built the coalition. They just said it. And some of them came out of domestic workers, right, organizations. So we're talking about unions like SEIU, but, and SEIU is now the biggest union in the country. Used to be, would be more like the Teamsters, right? These are shifts in the American society. And it's not going to be reliant on Black Lives Matter in the way that we saw the first movement build a model for how you go about creating change, and then people like Juvenile Law Center here in Philadelphia use it and say, here, we're going to try to change the laws. We're going to go in there and argue for better protections for our children. In this movement, I think a lot of these issues are there, have bubbled up. And now it's a matter of getting energy behind them. And that's why I say, if you can get Black Lives Matter, if you can get people who are on the progressive end of the political spectrum to say, I want to engage politically, I think we then open doors in a big way. And, somebody said to me that they were so discouraged in this moment with Trump and the fact that MAGA seems to control Washington thoroughly, House, Senate, and White House. And I said, I think history, from what I can tell, at my age, history doesn't stop, time doesn't stop. It's like a pendulum. And it's right now clearly in one direction. But it doesn't mean that it's not going to swing, and we've got to help it swing and jump on that swing to create the next moment in terms of American history.
You started off your remarks this evening really reminding us all what a diverse society we are living in today, how much more diverse it is than it was in 1960. But you also make the point in your book that it turns out that living in a more racially diverse society is in fact not a clear path to sort of racial, better race relations generally among people. Why not? Like, what is the message behind that? Here we are with a country that has never looked like this, as you said, the country that elected Obama that he grew up in. But in fact, schools are segregated again, as you mentioned. Economic inequality seems starker. Mass incarceration is persistent. However we improve our justice system, it doesn't improve for people of color. What will it take? That's a big question, but I was just struck by your truth stating, which is that diversity doesn't make it better.
You know, I think I'll take a risk here and just say that, so in my experience as a black man, I live in Washington, D.C. I live in a black neighborhood, although it's increasingly white. I mean, it's you know, gentrification is taking place.
Going the other way.
Yeah. And I always think, you know, here I am writing about a second civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter and Trayvon Martin and George Floyd and all this, and I think to myself, you know, if someone kills me on the street, it's less likely to be the white cop than a black kid with a gun. And I think, wow, that's kind of sad, that's tragic. And I think to myself, again, just as you said, Marsha, we live in a more diverse society. I don't think there's any doubt we've made progress in terms of race relations from first movement to this moment in second movement. And yet, here I am with this fear, right? And it seems to me, you would think, oh, well, that should be gone by now, but it's not. And the sort of tribal instinct that says, I live in a society still where whites have not only the majority population, but clearly the majority of wealth and political power in society, continues to dominate in the minds of many minorities. I think, you know, this is something that people ask me a lot these days. They say, why is it, you think, that a quarter of black men voted for Trump? Why did half of Latino men vote for Trump? And they're asking me this because I think it's pretty obvious. I think Trump's racist. And I'm thinking, you know, how can you make that concession and then say, yeah, but I'm going to support him? And I think the answer is there are lots of young men, especially of color, who say the status quo hasn't delivered for me. That they still see themselves more likely to end up in jail. I think it's like one of every 3 young black men.
Certainly in some communities, yes.
Are going to end up at some point doing time in jail. I think they are very clear about the poor quality of those schools and the lack of job opportunities and the stigmas. I mean, you think about Trayvon Martin and you think about he's a kid walking home from the 7-Eleven, I think, with Skittles and an iced tea. But the way that he was portrayed by people who were supportive of the man who shot him was, oh, he was this threatening black kid in a hoodie. And he's kind of, you know, bopping down the street and he's got the phones in his ears and it's raining and why is he out there anyway? And you understand, there's a lot of fear attached to that image in our world today. And again, that doesn't just mean you're white looking at that person. You can be black looking at that person. You can be Asian looking at, and all of this exists in an America that, to my mind, oftentimes, I think Trump plays on this, has a nostalgia, if you will, for white majority control of all areas of American life. So when you are dealing with this, we have this racial overlay, this tribal separation that is amplified by income, power, and opportunity.
Let me ask you my last question of the night. I have a gazillion other questions to ask you, but I want to ask you this one. Your book is titled The New Prize for These Eyes. What is the new prize?
Well, I think it would pretty clearly be that we would be able to recognize each other's humanity. And
So it's hopeful.
oh, it's very hopeful. To me, this is where I think I separate from lots of people, because I believe in that pendulum. And I believe that we can, in fact, come to a point where we are working to heal a lot of the division that's played on by people who oppose progressive change with regard to race, ethnicity, immigration in America. That we can do it. But it's a new challenge in a new day, and it requires new thinking and new platforms, new instruments of change. It's not a matter of going backward, it's a matter of going forward.
So my follow-up question, exercising moderator's prerogative, and then we're going to go to the Q&A, which is one of the other things, and you've said this repeatedly this evening, and so I just am curious, this, what I'm now calling sort of the back and forth, everything is a response to the other thing. Obama begot Trump, begot Biden, begot Trump. Is it an endless cycle, or do you imagine we get to a point where we're not constantly having this sort of almost like a jazz thing, almost play response, call response? Do we ever get to the moment where we're not waiting for the pendulum to hit us in the face again?
Well, I don't think, as I said earlier, I don't think time ever stops. And the question is, as the pendulum swings, does it swing to something different? Now, it's going to swing back and forth, I think, in terms of the political preferences, as Obama to Trump is a clear one A to B, right? But what happens when you swing to something different? We still have never had a woman as president of any color, right? And we've never, ever come to terms with saying, oh yeah, we are a nation of immigrants, and here is a workable immigration system that allows people to seek asylum and to come here, but it's one that we feel is under control of the American body politic. We can protect ourselves. We can swing to something not just A, B. We can swing potentially to some innovative new state. We're going in some new vision, new direction. If I was to be harsh about the Harris campaign last year, I would say that her biggest argument was she's not Donald Trump. We're not going backwards. We're not going back to the chaos, the name-calling, the racial division. But I would say she didn't give us a vision,
But we were going toward.
a new vision of what she saw for us as the American people, black, white, Asian, Hispanic. Just say, here's what I see, here's what we can be, and here's who I am to take you to this new place. I didn't get that sense from her.
Well, I'm hoping for the new prize. All right, we're ready for questions and answers.
All right, yes, we have some
Q&A.
time left for questions. Yes, right here in the middle. And please wait until one of our volunteers gets to you with the microphone. Otherwise, the recording will not pick you up. Over there on the right side.
Hi.
First of all, I want to shout out to DC, Calvin Coolidge.
All right.
Okay, all right, thank you.
That's my neighborhood high school.
Also, for Juvenile Justice Center, I did my first year in law school. I did my internship at some time. My question is,
Sorry, I'm not sure your mic is on. Might need to be flipped on.
hello?
Technology.
1, 2.
Okay. My question is, I'm a little bit older than you. We go through these cycles, all the time, and every generation got a new civil rights. So I'm thinking it's not so much that once one generation doesn't finish the job and the next one's job is to pick up the job. I think it's an evolutionary process, so it's kind of hard to criticize anybody or even give compliments to anybody else because everybody has to fight the fight they have to fight. So I just wanted your opinion about that. Because I've been following you forever, and you're always fighting.
Well, thanks, man. No, I think that's right. You know, that every generation is going to come to a new field of opportunities, but also a new field of challenges. And you got to make your way. And you have to find your way. It's not preordained. And that's one of the things that I worry about when people keep looking back and saying, who's the new Dr. King, and shouldn't we have the same kind of agenda that we had back then? It's a different playing field. It's a different game. It's a new civil rights era. So you're exactly right. Every generation has to deal with its own challenges and find an effective response. And you can't think, oh, you know, I think there's this tendency, the good old days, the golden old days. Remember Whitney Young, you know, and Dr. King and John Lewis. Those were here, and you say, wait, no. We've got heroes among us today. And it's just a different movement. Progressive whites play a key role in this new movement that they didn't play in the old movement. And again, I think, you know, people think, oh, well, everybody loved Dr. King. No, go back and read the history, right? So you think about it, and you think new heroes can emerge. I think what happened with Bishop Buddy in Washington, when she spoke directly and called for mercy, I thought that was a very interesting moment, because I hadn't heard her as a leading voice previously. I bet you hadn't ever heard of her. So I think these moments are happening, but it's just as you said, you know, you got to find, every generation has to find its moment, maybe find its voices.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Barbara.
Thank you very much for your insights that you brought forth from the book, which were very interesting. But you mentioned the fight between MAGA and the Black Lives Matter. And then you mentioned your own understandable fear that it's going to be the black kid with the gun who gets you. How do we find a way to move forward, or what do you think, that isn't violence? Because if the MAGA people are getting their political power basically from violence, as far as I can tell, and young people with guns are getting their way with violence. So how do we find a way to move forward that isn't violence?
Well, that's a really, to me, interesting question, because I think that you're mixing a couple things up. The key thing that I would point to in your logic is the consistent presence of fear. And I think Trump plays on this a lot. He pushes the fear button constantly with people. And he does it by demonizing people. So it could be the young black kid is demonized, but it's also the immigrant is demonized, is eating your pets. Remember, he's eating the pets of the people in Ohio. I mean, it's always that other tribe is coming to get you. And the violence, when he says, you know, when he was asked about white militia violence during the 2020 campaign, his response was stand back, stand by. He didn't condemn it. And in fact, he has condemned Black Lives Matter as a symbol of hate. So to me, what I hear from you is there's fear. And when I talked about the reality of high rates of violent crime in black communities, you sensed my fear. But it's not the same fear. To me, what is necessary in terms of black life in America is coming to honest confrontation with problems in our community and being honest and talking about it, such as crime. Or can we, as black people, and especially black politicians, we have black politicians, really focus on improving the quality of those schools for those kids and not be content with failing schools. that's an argument, I think, almost like an intramural, if you will. I don't think MAGA is going to be focused on that. They're focused on things like creating publicly funded vouchers that will let people create their own schools and move away, I think, from even efforts at integrated public schools. So I think it's a different kind, but fear is the common denominator in a lot of this conversation. And fear is key to dividing people, to demonizing people, to blaming people, and to lack of empathy for people.
Yes, right here in the middle.
Thanks again, and I just wanted to let you know how much I appreciate the conversation.
She's terrific, yeah.
That you represent in your book.
He
My
wrote the book.
question is that you spoke to an example of maybe being fearful of that young black kid in your neighborhood, you're being more fearful of that kid shooting you than the cops. Then I go to the thought of segregationists. And, you know, the economy or the social environment seems to be working in that vein. And you've chosen to live in a community that's seemingly black. Was that a thought of making sure that you and all that you bring to the table is being seen and appreciated by your community? Is that one way of helping out the community by and large? Because I imagine in DC, there's various economic stratospheres, so it's kind of mixed.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to get your perspective on the whole segregationist piece with respect to people of color. Are we moving back to communities of color so that we can be an icon, a beacon? Should we? Should we not?
You know, this is, first of all, I wish I was that thoughtful about where I live. But, you know, Charles Blow, the New York Times columnist, who's African American, he's written a book and makes the case that black people should go back to the South. Most black people live in the South. And he's making the argument that you can build political power by increasing black political presence in the South. But I don't think that's the argument you're making. You're talking about like someone like me as a role model in the community. And we moved there, my wife and I, more than 40 years ago. And I remember this because it's before I wrote Eyes on the Prize, and I was national political reporter for the Washington Post, and '84 was a campaign year, and I was gone so much, so she started ticking off the dates when I actually slept in the house, and it wasn't very many. You can imagine that comes up often in arguments. So when we moved there, you know, it's where we could afford to live, and as I said then, you know, you can see so much in American life through the neighborhoods because it had been a white neighborhood, then it had become a Jewish neighborhood, then it had become a middle-class black neighborhood as the whites and the Jews moved out to the suburbs, especially after the 60s and the riots, right? And then the black middle class started moving out, and it was more rental to working class blacks overwhelmingly. And that's the point at which I came in with the kids and the wife. And it was where we could afford to live and, you know, just felt comfortable in addition to, because it was a black neighborhood. And as I said to you now it's pretty close. I had to live in New York for a while for TV, and it was like a 10-year period. And when I came back, I said to my wife, you know, there are a lot of white people around here. You know, I mean, the neighborhood is just gentrified. And things like the public schools, which was the key reason that young white couples, I think, didn't stay. Now they stay. And, you know, they're working on the schools, or they have private schools that are popping up. It's, again, a different playing field, a different moment. Even as I think it's amazing that you see so many young white families make the decision that we are going to stay here and we're going to make this our turf. This is different. It's a different moment.
All right, in the interest of time, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. That concludes this portion of the program, but a reminder that copies of Juan's terrific book are for sale up in the lobby, courtesy of Uncle Bobby's, and he has also agreed to sign them as well. So let's all make our way up there. But before we do, one more round of applause for our two terrific speakers.
Thank you for coming.